My name is Brock Sanderson. I'm 35 years old and the firstborn of the Sanderson family, one of the most affluent and high-profile dynasties nestled within the opulent enclaves of the Hamptons, New York. On paper, I oversee the Sanderson family's investment portfolio, a multi-billion-dollar beast carefully managed from a glass-walled office high above the relentless pulse of Manhattan. My life, to the casual observer, is the very embodiment of success. Precision-tailored suits, luxury vehicles, handshakes with power brokers. It's the kind of existence most people dream about. But dreams have shadows, and if you peel back the glossy layers of prestige and privilege, what you'll find are scars, quiet old wounds I've carried for so long they've become invisible even to me. This morning I stand silently before the floor-to-ceiling window that dominates one side of my office, watching the city churn below. The streets of Manhattan writhe with energy. Cars stream past like veins pumping life into the heart of New York. Billboards flash, neon flickers on the mirrored surfaces of nearby skyscrapers. But inside me, there's a stillness. Or maybe an ache. It creeps in slowly, a hollow pressure pressing against my ribs, an emptiness I can't quite name. I've never been someone who complains. Growing up in the Sanderson household, that kind of vulnerability was considered weakness, something to be excised like a tumor. But today, for reasons I can't quite articulate, the weight feels heavier, like my breath isn't quite reaching the bottom of my lungs. People hear the name Sanderson and immediately conjure images of power and prestige. In the Hamptons, or really any elite corridor of New York, our name is synonymous with luxury. Expansive estates carved into oceanfront cliffs, orchestral galas under velvet tents, and champagne served like water. We are the family others whisper about, admire from afar, and envy behind tight smiles. My father, Philip Sanderson, clawed his way up from nothing, building a real estate empire that practically reshaped the coastline. My mother, Julia, is elegance incarnate, sharp as glass and poised as royalty. With her curated social network and flawless reputation, she transformed our name into something more than a brand. It became a symbol. But appearances are deceiving. No one knows that better than I do. Behind the Sanderson image lies a meticulous performance. Every photograph, every interview, every public appearance is rehearsed, calculated. As the oldest son, I was never a child in the traditional sense. I was an ambassador in training. From the age of 12, I was attending board meetings, dressed in blazers too big for my frame, silently watching seasoned investors while pretending to understand terms like arbitrage and liquidity. I was taught that responsibility was not a virtue, it was a requirement. My father's mantra echoed through our halls like scripture. Brock, you are the keeper of this family's legacy. Never let the flame die. So I didn't. I kept it burning. Relentlessly. I became the man they expected me to be. I absorbed the pressure until it no longer felt like pressure. It just felt like life. But then there's Lance. Ah, Lance. Just thinking of my younger brother conjures a mixture of frustration and reluctant affection. He's 28, magnetic, reckless, the human equivalent of a shooting star, brilliant, dazzling, and destined to crash. Where I was molded into a caretaker of the family legacy, Lance has always been the wild card. Handsome in a movie star kind of way. Effortlessly charming, with a smile that could disarm even our mother at her most severe. He's the kind of person who doesn't walk into a room, he takes it over. Unlike me, Lance seems burdened by nothing. Responsibility rolls off him like water on marble. Nights spent at exclusive clubs, spontaneous trips to Europe, a revolving door of romantic entanglements. His life is chaos, wearing designer cologne. And yet, despite the trail of wreckage he leaves behind, my parents cradle him like something fragile, too precious to scold. Lance is still young, my mother always says, her tone soft but unwavering. He'll find his way. But I know the truth, we both do. We grew up together in that grand Hampton estate, surrounded by manicured gardens and staff who addressed us like royalty. I remember us racing barefoot across the lawns, the sun casting long shadows behind us. Even back then, I played the role of protector. One summer afternoon, Lance shattered a priceless Ming Dynasty vase, an heirloom my father prized more than most people. Without hesitation, I claimed responsibility. My father's fury was volcanic. The punishment was swift and humiliating. Lance, meanwhile, watched from the stairs, a smirk dancing on his lips. "Thanks, Brock," he said, before darting away to continue playing. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing, shielding him, being the dependable older brother. But in hindsight, I see it differently. That moment, and many that followed, were not acts of love. They were rehearsals for a long play, about enabling. The Sanderson favoritism didn't begin there, but it solidified that day like concrete. When I graduated top of my class, my father's acknowledgement was a simple nod. Good, that's expected. But when Lance failed his driving test for the third time, my mother wrapped him in her arms and whispered, "Don't worry, darling, you'll get it next time." I tell myself I'm not jealous, that I've accepted my role. But there's a quiet resentment growing roots in places I don't often look. In this curated storm of ambition and dysfunction, one person grounds me. Olivia. She's 34, an accomplished endocrinologist at a leading Manhattan hospital. Olivia is the polar opposite of everything the Sandersons represent. And that's exactly why I fell in love with her. We met 6 years ago during a charity event my family hosted. The ballroom sparkled with decadence, crystal chandeliers, a live string quartet, hors d'oeuvres served on silver trays. But in the middle of all that excess stood Olivia, dressed in a modest, elegant blue gown, laughing gently as she spoke with fellow physicians about hormone receptors. Her presence was disarming, real, unshaped by performance or expectation. In that moment, I didn't feel like Brock Sanderson, heir to a legacy. I just felt like a man, quietly falling. Olivia is brilliant, discerning, and emotionally fluent in ways I'll never be. She doesn't flinch in the face of family drama, nor does she bow to the weight of the Sanderson name. To her, I'm just Brock, a man who sometimes doubts, sometimes stumbles, but who never stops trying to do the right thing. She's the only person with whom I can be entirely honest, the only one I trust with the full weight of my truth. Just last week, Lance found another way to unravel everything. I got a call at 2 a.m. from a casino in Atlantic City. He'd racked up an astronomical tab, tens of thousands gone in a single evening, and left it unpaid. I flew out that morning, handled the mess, and dragged him home, half conscious and reeking of bourbon. My parents barely blinked. My mother just said, "Keep an eye on your brother." As if that's all I was ever meant to do. There are moments when all I want is to shout, to demand an answer from my parents, to ask them why it always falls on me to clean up after Lance. Every time he makes a mess, it's my hands that end up dirty, my time that's consumed, my reputation that's leveraged to keep the family name pristine. And in those moments, when the resentment tightens like a vice around my chest, Olivia is the constant that keeps me from unraveling. She doesn't say much, but she doesn't need to. Her presence alone is enough to tether me back to myself. But today felt different. When Lance called this morning, his voice wasn't its usual mixture of charm and deflection. The cocky nonchalance I'd grown so used to was gone. In its place was something foreign, unsettling, a tremble, an unspoken urgency. "Rock," he said, barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you. It's serious. Please." Those words replayed in my mind all day like a warning bell. I sat in my office pretending to work but really just watching the seconds tick by on my antique clock, trying to predict the size and shape of the disaster Lance was about to unveil. And I knew in my gut, this wasn't going to be another casino bill or a drunken argument gone viral. This felt deeper, more dangerous. As I prepared to leave and meet him, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother, Julia Sanderson. Her voice, as always, was composed, clipped, each word delivered with the precision of a scalpel. "Rock, come home tonight. There's a family matter. We need you here." That was it. No explanation, no warmth. The kind of command that made it clear this wasn't optional. My pulse quickened. When my mother speaks like that, it can only mean one thing. Something has gone terribly wrong, and it centers around Lance. I answered with a terse "Yes, Mother," and ended the call, already feeling the storm forming. Driving from Manhattan to the Hamptons should have been familiar, even comforting. The winding roads, the towering trees, the glimpses of sunset painting gold over the Atlantic, all the signs of summer's peak surrounded me. But I barely noticed. My mind raced with scenarios, each more troubling than the last. Had Lance broken the law? Was someone hurt? Was the media involved? I texted Olivia, "Something's happened. I might need you tonight." She replied almost instantly, "I'm here. Be careful." She never pried, never demanded answers. That's what I needed more than anything, someone who trusted me enough to wait for the truth. By the time I arrived at the Sanderson estate, night had draped itself over the landscape. The mansion stood like a cathedral against the dark marble columns, lit from beneath, stained glass casting colored shadows onto the front steps. The house looked exactly as it always had, impeccable, grand, but tonight it felt more like a courthouse awaiting a verdict. Harold, our longtime butler, opened the door before I could knock. His demeanor was as professional as ever, but I noticed a flicker of anxiety in his eyes. That alone confirmed the gravity of what I was walking into. "Master Brock," he said quietly, "they're waiting for you in the grand living room." I nodded silently, stepping into the house. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves braced for impact. Inside, the scene was almost theatrical. My father, Philip, sat in his commanding leather chair, a glass of scotch dangling from his fingers. His face was carved in stone, stern, unreadable. My mother stood by the tall windows, arms crossed over her chest, her emerald dress cascading like armor. And there, on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, was Lance. His head hung low, hands clenched tightly in his lap, as if physically holding himself together. No one spoke as I entered, but the weight of their silence was louder than words. "Rock, sit," my father commanded, his tone brokering no argument. I obeyed, choosing a chair across from them, angling myself to face all three. I straightened my shoulders, put on the mask I'd worn my whole life. "What's going on?" I asked, directing the question to no one in particular but looking straight at Lance. He didn't answer right away. He mumbled something under his breath, inaudible. "Speak up," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. My mother inhaled deeply, as if preparing to step onto a battlefield. "Lance has something he needs to tell you, and we need your help, Brock. As always." That last part, "as always," hit me like a slap. She said it so casually, so expectantly, as though it was a given, as though I had no choice but to shoulder the burden once again. Lance finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red. He looked like he hadn't slept, possibly hadn't eaten. For the first time in years, he looked afraid. "Rock," he croaked, voice cracking. I'm getting married." It took me a full second to process the words. Married? Lance? The same Lance who couldn't commit to a dinner reservation, let alone a relationship? I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but there was none. "To whom?" I asked, already bracing myself. "Vivian Bennett," he whispered, and I froze. Vivian. I knew the name. She was a 25-year-old model, not someone from our circle, but I'd met him twice, maybe 3 times. Stunning, ambitious, definitely not someone I expected Lance to be serious about. "She's pregnant," he added quickly, as if ripping off a bandage. The words hit like a bomb detonating in the room. My father's reaction was immediate. His glass hit the table with a sharp, violent thud. "Pregnant?" he barked. "Before marriage? Are you out of your mind?" My mother moved toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of calming solidarity, though her expression was just as icy. "We'll handle this," she said. "We have to. But we need a plan." Then, as always, their eyes turned to me. "Rock," my mother said, her voice deceptively gentle. "You'll take care of this, you always do." I wanted to scream, to shout it, that I was exhausted, that this wasn't fair, that I wasn't their fixer, their cleaner, their scapegoat. But instead, I nodded. Because I had no choice. Lance began to explain, haltingly, shamefully. Vivian had told him she was 4 months pregnant. She demanded marriage, threatening to go public if he refused. She claimed to have proof, texts, pictures, even videos. Enough to unleash a scandal that could tarnish the Sanderson name forever. "Are you sure it's yours?" I asked coldly. Lance hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. "She says it is. And I believe her." There was a part of me that wanted to grab Lance by the shoulders and shake him, demand to know why he had allowed things to spiral so recklessly out of control. But I stayed silent. Silence is second nature when you grow up in a world where appearances outweigh emotions, where asking questions is considered weakness, and dissent is masked behind polite compliance. My mother's voice, now curiously composed, sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "We'll arrange a wedding," she announced with the elegance of a queen issuing a royal decree. "A grand one. Lavish, impeccable, something worthy of the Sanderson name. We'll eliminate any whispers of impropriety before they begin." She turned her attention toward me, eyes cool but commanding. "Brock, you'll handle everything. The venue, the guest list, the press coverage, every detail. Make it memorable. Make it flawless." A fresh surge of anger bloomed in my chest. Always me. Every time. Every mess, every complication, every looming threat to the family name. Somehow, it always became my responsibility. But I didn't argue. I didn't even sigh. I nodded, like the well-trained son I was raised to be. "All right," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I'll take care of it." My father's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, his eyes lingering on me longer than usual, as if recognizing the weight he continued to place on my shoulders. But true to form, he said nothing. And Lance, he didn't look up. He just sat there, hunched and small, guilt oozing from his posture like smoke from a dying fire. When I left the estate that evening, the burden I carried felt heavier than ever. A wedding. A baby. The specter of scandal was threatening to undo everything our family had worked so ruthlessly to protect. I drove back to Manhattan with a storm raging in my head. Every decision felt urgent. Every silence felt dangerous. When I stepped through the door of our apartment, Olivia was there, sitting cross-legged on the couch, with a glass of Cabernet in one hand and a thick medical journal resting open in the other. She looked up the moment I entered, her sharp brown eyes immediately scanning my face, reading every nuance, every fracture. "Rock," she asked gently, setting her glass down and rising to greet me. "Are you all right?" She wrapped her arms around me, her warmth immediate, grounding. I let the mask slip, just enough to exhale. Then I told her everything. About Lance, about Vivian, about the hasty wedding that had now become my responsibility. Olivia listened in silence, as she always did, but I could see her mind working, dissecting every piece of information like a medical case study. When I finished, she took my hand and said, with her usual calm precision, "Brock, I know you feel responsible for your family. You've always protected them, held them together, but this feels wrong. And I need you to be careful." I frowned. "Careful of what?" "You know," she said, squeezing my fingers, "this Vivian girl, something doesn't add up. If she's threatening the entire Sanderson legacy to get what she wants, this might not be about love, or even a child. You need to find out what's really going on." A cold shiver passed through me. Olivia was rarely wrong. Her instincts were sharp, her analysis methodical. If she sensed something off, there was a reason. "I'll look into it," I promised. Still, the show had to go on, and a grand wedding was already in motion. There was no time for hesitation. 2 weeks later, I found myself in the center of a whirlwind, orchestrating one of the most extravagant events the Sandersons had ever hosted. The wedding was to be held at a 5-star resort in the Hamptons, a place we'd used before for high-profile functions. But this wasn't just another party. This was damage control, dressed in white orchids and crystal chandeliers. Every detail was scrutinized. A Michelin-starred chef was flown in from Italy to craft the 4-course dinner. A symphony orchestra from Paris was contracted for the reception. The guest list included everyone from Wall Street titans to Oscar-winning celebrities. The entire affair was projected to cost well into the millions, but for the Sandersons, money was never the concern. Reputation was. And I was charged with defending it at all costs. On the eve of the first event, I stood on the balcony of my suite overlooking the setup below. The venue was a masterpiece, rows of white silk-covered tables, wine glasses lined like soldiers, and archways draped with thousands of imported orchids. It should have inspired pride, but all I felt was unease. Olivia's words echoed in my mind. "You need to dig deeper." The first event was a sunset cocktail party by the resort's Olympic-sized pool. I wore a tailored gray suit, custom-made for the occasion. Olivia walked beside me in a flowing turquoise silk dress, effortlessly elegant. As always, she smiled and mingled, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. But I could tell she was observing, analyzing, cataloging everything. As we approached the bar, where servers were pouring champagne like water, she leaned in close and whispered, "You okay?" "I'm fine," I replied automatically, though my tone betrayed me. "You're thinking about her," she said, not even phrasing it as a question. I nodded slightly. "Vivian's over there," Olivia murmured, her eyes flicking toward a corner of the garden. I followed her gaze. Vivian stood out instantly, dressed in a form-fitting red gown that shimmered under the string lights. Her blonde hair cascaded in soft waves, and her smile was dazzling, effortless. She laughed with guests as if she belonged. No, as if she owned the moment. She looked radiant, untouchable. But as I watched her, something gnawed at me. She was too poised, too polished. Something about the way she carried herself didn't match the image of a woman 4 months pregnant. I saw none of the subtle discomforts I'd come to associate with early pregnancy. No fatigue in her eyes, no adjustments in posture, no guarded hand resting protectively on her belly. "Rock," Olivia said quietly. "I've been watching her." I turned to her, instantly alert. "She's not drinking alcohol," she continued, "which makes sense for a pregnant woman. But she's not drinking anything else either. No juice, just plain water." I frowned. "That's odd." "And earlier," Olivia added, lowering her voice even more, "I saw her eating sashimi, raw salmon. You know that's one of the first things pregnant women are advised to avoid. I looked back at Vivian, who was now accepting compliments from a pair of socialites. She didn't look like someone forced into marriage, she looked like someone who was winning. And suddenly my doubts became more than just suspicions. Something was very wrong. I frowned, trying to digest Olivia's words, but they echoed with unsettling clarity. Maybe she's just careless, I offered, though even to my own ears the excuse sounded hollow, like a weak shield against an oncoming truth. Olivia didn't respond right away. Instead, she gave me a look, the kind that said she saw right through me. Then she shook her head with calm certainty. No, Brock, it's not just carelessness. Something doesn't add up. I'm a doctor, I know the signs, and I know what to look for. Her voice remained low but insistent. Vivian hasn't shown any visible weight gain, no fatigue, none of the physical nuances I'd expect from someone 4 months along. And have you noticed the way she draws attention to her stomach? It's too deliberate. Every time someone brings up the baby, she suddenly places her hand there, like she's performing. Her words hit me with the force of realization. I looked toward Vivienne again, observing with new eyes. She stood near the poolside lounge, surrounded by an adoring group of older women. Her laughter rang out like wind chimes, bright and controlled. One of the women asked her about the baby, and without hesitation, Vivienne placed her hand gently on her belly. "Oh, it's already kicking," she announced with theatrical enthusiasm, her voice taking on an exaggerated pitch. I watched closely. Olivia was right. The gesture felt too timed, too precise, as though she were following a script. Her responses were vague, her enthusiasm a little too polished. A practiced kind of charm that didn't quite ring true. The next evening, Olivia and I found a quiet moment in the resort's private garden. The moonlight bathed the rose bushes in silver, and the rhythmic crash of waves provided a rare moment of serenity. I held her hand tightly, grateful for her presence in this sea of deceit. "I think she's lying," Olivia said without preamble, her tone resolute. "I can't say for certain, but I don't believe she's pregnant." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly as I rubbed my temples. If she's lying, then what's the point? Why force Lance into marriage? What could she possibly gain from all of this? Olivia didn't hesitate. Money, status, maybe revenge. Who knows what her motivations are, Brock, but whatever it is, this is bigger than a relationship gone wrong. She's manipulating everyone, including your brother, and if she's lying about the pregnancy, we need to find out before this goes any further. Her words solidified the suspicions that had been creeping into my mind since day one. The uncertainty that had kept me awake at night now felt like a storm gathering force. I decided to start with Lance. That night, during the yacht dinner cruise arranged for the second day of festivities, I pulled him aside. The lights of the Hamptons shimmered in the distance as guests sipped cocktails and laughed beneath canopies of fairy lights. It should have been picturesque, but all I felt was dread. "Lance," I said quietly, "we need to talk." He stiffened instantly. "Brock, not now." "Yes, now," I insisted. "Do you even know when she's due? Have you met her doctor, seen a single piece of medical documentation?" He glared at me, eyes flashing with a mixture of defensiveness and fear. "Why do you always have to dig? Can't you just let me be happy for once?" I almost laughed at the irony. "Happy? Lance, you're not happy. You're terrified and you know it." "I believe her," he snapped, turning away. "That's all that matters." But it wasn't. Not to me. Not when our family's name, legacy, and stability were at stake. Not when Olivia's every instinct screamed that something was off. By the third day, the wedding day, my nerves were fraying. I stood at the edge of the venue, watching as guests arrived in waves of designer suits and flowing gowns. The sun bathed the white tents in gold, and soft string music played from a tucked-away quartet. It was beautiful, elegant, and deeply wrong. Vivian emerged just before the ceremony began. She looked ethereal in a designer wedding gown, its delicate lace and sweeping train billowing slightly in the afternoon breeze. Her veil shimmered in the light. She was a vision, but one that left me cold. Her eyes, beneath all that beauty, held something else. Something unreadable. She moved like royalty, every gesture calculated, every smile rehearsed. As I adjusted the setup one final time, Olivia appeared beside me. She leaned in, whispering, "Brock, I did some checking." I looked at her sharply. "She said she's getting prenatal care at St. Anne's in Manhattan, right?" Olivia said. I nodded slowly. "Well, I called a contact at the hospital. There's no record of her ever being treated there. Nothing, no appointments, no patient file." My heart began to race. "Are you sure?" "Positive, Brock. She's hiding something, and we need to figure it out before it's too late." I turned to watch Vivian take her place beside Lance, beaming at the crowd like she was walking a red carpet. Her hands were clasped in front of her, stomach subtly pushed forward as if reminding everyone of the life she claimed to carry. But there was no warmth in her gaze, only control. "I'll handle it," I whispered back, "tonight." After the ceremony, the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and orchestrated toasts. Guests clinked glasses, fireworks burst above the shoreline, and photographers captured every glittering moment. But I couldn't enjoy any of it. I was barely present. Beneath my exterior, a plan was forming. Later that evening, when the crowd had thinned and most guests had retired to their suites, I approached a staff member and asked him to summon Vivienne to a small private room under the guise of discussing final photo arrangements. Olivia and I arrived first. The room was modest compared to the grandeur of the rest of the resort. Wood-paneled walls, a single long table, and low lighting that made the space feel more intimate than intimidating. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. I wasn't sure what I'd say or how Vivian would react, but I knew one thing. This farce had gone on long enough. Vivian entered a few minutes later, still wearing the vibrant red cocktail dress from earlier. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. She smiled brightly, as if unaware of the tension crackling in the room. "Rock, Olivia," she said with syrupy sweetness. "Is something wrong? I thought everything for tomorrow was set." "Please, have a seat," I said, gesturing to a velvet-upholstered chair across from us. She sat, crossing her legs gracefully, her smile never wavering. But Olivia and I were done smiling. Though Vivian's smile stayed fixed on her face, I noticed her fingers tightening on the hem of her dress, white-knuckled with tension. Her composure, once unshakable, was beginning to unravel. She was trying to hold it together, but the small signs betrayed her. Olivia stood beside me, her posture calm but vigilant. There was a quiet intensity in her eyes, sharp, clinical, the gaze of a physician who has just identified a symptom no one else had noticed. It was like watching her prepare for a diagnosis, not of a patient's body, but of someone's deepest secret. "Vivian," I began, keeping my voice calm and measured, even as a storm of emotion churned beneath the surface. "We need to talk about the baby." That smile, perfect and rehearsed, faltered for just a second. A twitch at the corner of her mouth, a shift in her gaze. It was barely perceptible, but enough. She knew. We were no longer playing her game. "The baby?" she echoed, her voice slightly higher than usual, as though trying to feign surprise. "What? What do you mean?" Olivia stepped forward, gentle yet firm. "Vivian, I'm an endocrinologist, and I've been observing you closely over the last few days. Some things have raised red flags." Vivian blinked rapidly, her composure slipping inch by inch. "You said you're 4 months pregnant," Olivia continued, "but I haven't seen any of the usual physical changes. No visible weight gain, no fatigue, no changes in behavior or appetite. Last night you ate sashimi, which most women in your condition would avoid, and earlier today I made a call to the hospital you claimed was handling your prenatal care. They have no record of you." The room fell into silence, so complete it was almost tangible. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the soft rustle of Livia's dress as she shifted slightly. Vivian's eyes bounced between us, her breath quickening, her lips parting as though to speak, but nothing came. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice tremulous, fragile. "I'm pregnant. Lance knows." I leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with her. "Vivian, if you're lying, now's the time to come clean. We're not here to harm you, but we deserve the truth. Why are you doing this? Why force a marriage based on a lie?" For a brief moment, she froze. Her eyes shimmered, not with guilt, but with something else, defiance. And then, like a snapped branch, she let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "You think you're so clever," she said, her tone shifting, no longer sweet but edged with steel. "You think I'm some gold digger trying to hustle your precious family." My pulse spiked, not from fear or rage, but because I knew, finally, we were getting somewhere. "If that's not what this is, then explain, help us understand." Vivian's shoulders trembled. She looked down, her hands curling into fists on her lap. When she finally looked up again, her eyes glistened, not from shame, but from something deeper. Pain. "You want the truth?" she asked, voice cracking. "Fine, I'm not pregnant. I never was." The confession struck me like a physical blow. My breath caught. Across from me, Olivia's fingers tensed at her sides, though her expression remained composed. Behind her calm eyes, I could see the same shock I felt. "Why?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why go to such lengths?" Vivian drew in a shaky breath, her entire body trembling as she spoke. 2 years ago, I was pregnant. Lance and we had a real relationship. At least I thought we did. When I told him about the baby, he freaked out, said it would ruin his life, that he couldn't be a father, not then, not ever. He paused, swallowing hard. Him pressured me to end it, said it was the only way to save us. I loved him, so I listened. I didn't want to, but I did it, for him. Tears began to form in her eyes, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. The procedure, something went wrong. There were complications. The doctors told me I'd never be able to have children again. Her voice broke. She looked away, ashamed and devastated. I felt the air leave my lungs. Lance, my own brother. I knew he was reckless, impulsive, even selfish. But this was something else. Something monstrous. Olivia reached across the table and gently touched my hand beneath the surface. It was a subtle gesture, but it steadied me. I'm so sorry, Vivian, Olivia said softly. But why pretend? Why fake it now? Why drag Lance into this again? Vivian's expression hardened with grief and rage. Because he destroyed me, she said, her voice a mix of anguish and fury. After everything, he still came back, but only when he was drunk. Only to use me. Then he'd disappear again like I was nothing. Her tears flowed freely now. I lost everything. My chance at being a mother, my dignity. And still, he treated me like I was disposable. So I decided if he wouldn't take responsibility, I'd make him. I knew the Sandersons feared scandal more than anything. I threatened to go to the press, and you all forced his hand. I was speechless. The room seemed to spin around me. Everything I thought I knew about this woman, about my brother, collapsed in that moment. Vivian turned to me, desperate. I didn't know what else to do. Who would believe me? I'm just a model, Lance's weekend fling. No one from your world would ever see me as anything more. She sobbed quietly into her hands. Please, keep this between us. I'll cancel the wedding. I'll disappear, I promise. Just, please, don't expose me. Olivia looked at me, her eyes full of empathy and concern. Vivian, she said gently, we understand your pain. We really do. But if you want Lance to be held accountable, if you want real justice, you have to be honest. You can't keep running. Vivian didn't respond. She just wept silently, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. I looked at her, then at Olivia, unsure of what to do. What do you think? I asked quietly. Olivia was quiet for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. If we reveal this now, during the wedding, it will be catastrophic, for your family, for Vivian. I think we should wait. Just for now. I nodded, though it felt like a weighty compromise. I looked at Vivian, still curled into herself, consumed by emotion. I felt something I hadn't expected. Empathy and rage. Not at her, but at Lance. He had caused all of this. And now, it was time for someone to finally hold him accountable. Lance hadn't just hurt Vivian, he'd pushed her into desperation, scarred her emotionally, and somehow, as always, I was the one left to deal with the wreckage. It wasn't just her life he'd disrupted, he'd dragged mine into the fire too, putting me in the impossible position of choosing between truth and protection. And yet again, I was the one cleaning up his mess, trying to contain a scandal that could rip our family apart. But Olivia was right. As much as the truth demanded daylight, exposing it at this moment would be catastrophic for everyone. It wouldn't just humiliate Lance, it would devastate Vivian, damage our family's standing, and tear apart everything we'd spent generations building. I needed a strategy, a way to shield the family name while forcing Lance to finally confront the consequences he had always dodged. I turned to Vivian, who sat quietly, still dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her expression wary, uncertain. Vivian, I began, keeping my tone steady even as turmoil churned inside me. I won't tell anyone, at least not right now. She looked up slowly, confusion etched across her tear-streaked face. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to go through with the wedding, I said, and each word felt like it weighed a ton. Not because I want to shield Lance, not because I believe in some fantasy, but because I want him to face what he's done. If you leave now, he'll escape again, free to ruin someone else's life without a second thought. But if you stay, he'll be bound to you, to this decision. He'll have to live with it every day. Vivian blinked, struggling to process what I was saying. You want me to stay married to him? Her voice trembled, a mixture of disbelief and fear. I don't want you to be alone in this, I said, my tone gentler now. I don't want to see you hurt more than you already have, but I also don't want him to walk away without learning what it means to be accountable. And I promise you this: my family will not harm you, not while I have any say." She stared at me, her gaze flickering between fear, doubt, and something close to reluctant understanding. "You'll keep this secret?" she asked cautiously. "You won't tell your parents?" I nodded slowly. "Not yet. But after the wedding, I'll find a way to make Lance face what he's done, and I'll make sure you're protected. I give you my word, Vivian." Olivia stood quietly beside me, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. She hadn't spoken during the exchange, but her hand gently touched mine, a silent affirmation. When I glanced at her, she nodded slightly. She understood the cost of the decision I was making, and approved, even if it went against every instinct I had. Vivian wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, her voice hushed and shaky. "All right," she whispered. "I'll do it. I'll go through with the wedding. But, please, don't leave me alone in this." "You won't be alone," Olivia said softly, stepping forward. "We'll be with you. We'll help however we can." Vivian nodded, but the pain in her eyes remained. I stood, feeling like I'd aged a decade in the last 20 minutes. "You should go back to the party now," I said gently. "People will wonder if you're gone too long." Vivian rose to her feet, dabbing at her face once more. With practiced grace, she forced herself to smile, reapplying her mask of perfection. She left the room with careful poise, leaving Olivia and me behind in the quiet that followed. Once the door clicked shut, I let out a long breath and turned to Olivia. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Her eyes met mine, warm, wise, unwavering. "You did the best you could, Brock. Maybe the only thing you could. But this isn't over. Lance needs to face consequences, and when the time is right, we'll make sure he does." The next day, the wedding ceremony unfolded with all the grandeur the Sanderson name could summon. Vivian glided down the aisle in a designer gown, her veil flowing behind her like smoke. Lance stood waiting with a forced smile, his hands visibly tense. Guests clapped, oblivious to the truth beneath the glitter. Champagne flowed like rivers, and the Hampton sun cast its golden glow over every flower petal, every string quartet note, every carefully curated moment. To the world it was a perfect Sanderson affair, but beneath the perfection I stood watchful, hollow, barely present. Olivia stayed close, her presence a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in carrying this truth. No one knew what had occurred behind closed doors. No one saw the pain etched in Vivian's smile or the cold war behind Lance's eyes. The ceremony was flawless, but I knew truth doesn't stay buried forever, and when it rose to the surface, it would change everything. 2 weeks later, I called my parents and requested a family meeting at the estate. I kept the message vague, just that it concerned Lance and that it was urgent. My mother's voice on the phone was clipped with concern. She didn't ask questions, but I could tell she was already bracing for impact. Olivia and I drove to the Hamptons on a crisp autumn afternoon, the trees shedding gold and crimson leaves that blanketed the road. The estate loomed ahead, its marble columns standing tall against a changing season. For years, it had represented legacy, tradition, and wealth, but today it felt like a courtroom. When we entered the grand living room, my parents were already there. My father Philip sat in his favorite leather chair, a glass of whiskey in hand, his expression cool but alert. My mother Julie stood by the window, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, her posture rigid. Lance was slouched on the couch, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Vivian stood beside the fireplace, her posture stiff, her gaze glued to the floor. "What is this about, Brock?" my father asked, voice sharp with impatience. "You said it was urgent. Don't waste our time." I felt Olivia's fingers brush against mine. I took a deep breath. "This is about Lance," I said clearly, "and about Vivian, and the truth about their marriage." Lance bolted upright. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped, his voice defensive, a tremor betraying his fear. "Brock, shut up." I ignored him. Before the wedding, Olivia and I spoke with Vivian. We had doubts, we asked questions. I turned to Vivian gently. "Vivian, would you like to tell them, or should I?" She hesitated, trembling. Then, barely audible, she said, I'm not pregnant. I never was." The silence that followed was seismic. My mother's eyes widened, my father's grip tightened on his glass. Lance looked like he'd been struck across the face. And in that moment, the cracks in our perfect facade finally began to show. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't just shock. It was devastation. She looked as though her carefully crafted world had just cracked open beneath her feet, Across from her, my father clutched his whiskey glass so tightly his knuckles turned white, his expression dark and unreadable. "Not pregnant?" he roared, the fury in his voice shaking the room. "You mean to tell me you faked a pregnancy? You manipulated this family into a wedding under false pretenses? What the hell is the meaning of this?" "Let her finish," I said sharply, my voice more forceful than I'd intended. "There's more." Vivian trembled, her fingers twisting together in her lap, but somehow she found the courage to speak. Her voice was unsteady, fragile. "2 years ago," she began, "I really was pregnant, with Lance's child, but he didn't want it. He said it would ruin his life, ruin everything." She paused, breath catching, tears slipping down her face. "He pressured me to terminate the pregnancy, said we had no future if I kept the baby, and foolishly, I loved him, so I did what he asked." Vivian drew a shaky breath, but something went wrong during the procedure. There were complications. The doctors told me I'd never be able to have children again. The silence in the room turned suffocating. Her voice broke completely as she added, "And even after that, he still came to me. Only when he was drunk. Only to use me. Then he'd leave again, like I was nothing." She lowered her head, shoulders shaking. "I faked this pregnancy, not to hurt anyone, but to make him face what he did. I wanted him to finally take responsibility." My heart pounded with grief and rage. The weight of her words, the rawness of her confession, it was too real to ignore. Across the room, my mother began to cry, quiet and restrained at first, then breaking into sobs. She tried to suppress them with trembling fingers. My father stood abruptly, his whiskey sloshing in the glass. His voice when he spoke was low and dangerous. "Do you have proof?" he asked, eyes locked on Vivian with unyielding intensity. Vivian nodded, hands shaking as she reached into her bag. She pulled out a slim folder and held it out. "These are my medical records," she said. "From the abortion, and the complications afterward. Everything is in there." He snatched the folder from her grasp, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the documents with mechanical focus. His jaw clenched tighter with each turn. Lance suddenly stood, eyes wide, panic rising in his voice. "She's lying," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Vivian. "She's manipulating all of you. I never forced her to do anything. This is just a scam." "Enough," I shouted, stepping toward him. My fists were clenched at my sides, and I had to fight the overwhelming urge to strike him. "Don't you dare call her a liar, Lance. Don't you dare. You did this. You pressured her into an abortion. You used her. And now you think you can pretend it never happened." He opened his mouth to argue, but my mother's voice cut through the moment like glass. "Brock," she said, her cheeks stained with tears. "Why didn't you tell us before the wedding? Why didn't you stop it?" I turned to her slowly, my chest aching. "Because Lance needs to face what he's done. Do you have any idea what it's like to be told you'll never be a mother? The kind of pain that causes? I wasn't about to let him walk away from that." My father remained silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving the documents in his hands. When he finally looked up, his face was blank, but his voice carried weight. "What do you want us to do now, Brock?" I took a breath, heavy with purpose. "He needs to be held accountable," I said. "Whether that means staying married or something else, he has to take responsibility for what he did. And Vivian? She needs our protection. She's suffered enough." Vivian looked at me with a mix of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The meeting ended in a heavy, uneasy silence. No decisions were made, and no clear path forward was established. But the truth was finally out, and that was the first step. As Olivia and I drove back to Manhattan that night, I felt a strange kind of relief. The burden of secrecy had been lifted. The damage was undeniable. But so was the honesty. For once, I hadn't kept quiet to protect appearances. I had chosen what was right. The weeks that followed were tense. The illusion my parents had upheld for so long began to crumble. My mother, once the queen of composure, called me frequently, her voice often quivering, with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Why did you have to stir everything up, Brock?" she asked one night. "We could have handled it quietly." I wanted to tell her that silence had been the problem all along, that their habit of sweeping things under the rug was what had allowed Lance to become what he was. But I didn't say it. She needed time to accept the truth about her golden boy. My father, on the other hand, barely spoke to me. When we met for dinner, his eyes were cold, distant. He didn't blame me aloud, but his silence said everything. He was disappointed, not just in Lance, but in me, for breaking the family's illusion of control. Despite the tension, I felt no regret. I had chosen conscience over comfort. And that mattered. Lance, predictably, did not change. A week after the meeting, he called me in a fury. His voice was wild, seething. "You've ruined my life, Brock," he yelled. "Vivian's a manipulative witch, and you took her side." I tried to stay calm. "You hurt her, Lance. It's time to take responsibility." But he wasn't listening. He never did. He hung up on me mid-sentence. Not long after, my mother informed me that Lance had visited a lawyer. He intended to file for divorce immediately, thinking he could slip out of the mess, as always. But this time my parents drew the line. I wasn't at the meeting, but my mother later described it to me. My father's voice, she said, was unwavering. "You will stay married to her for at least 2 years, he declared. "If you walk away now, Vivian will receive a settlement, one that reflects the damage you've caused. You will not escape again. This isn't a request, Lance, it's an order." For the first time, my parents didn't protect him. They didn't shield him from consequences, and perhaps, just perhaps, they saw the cost of their long-standing indulgence. Vivian, through all of this, remained silent. She moved out of the estate, into a modest apartment in Manhattan, funded quietly by the family. She asked for nothing more. No interviews, no revenge, just space. And perhaps, a chance to rebuild what was left of her life. Vivian rarely appeared in public after the confrontation. The scandal never broke, and the Sanderson name remained untouched in the public eye. But inside our private circles, the fracture was clear. She disappeared from society's radar, quietly moving into her Manhattan apartment and living a life far removed from the chaos we had all barely survived. I saw her only once after the fallout, unexpectedly, at a modest cafe not far from the hospital where Olivia worked. She looked tired, worn by the weight of all she had endured. But there was something different about her that day. Her eyes no longer held the desperate hollowness they once did. There was pain, still, of course, but also something else. Relief, maybe even resilience. "Thank you, Brock," she said quietly, her voice calm and sincere. "I don't know what I would have done if you and Olivia hadn't stood up for me." I nodded, unable to fully articulate what I felt. I couldn't take away her suffering, but I hoped that somehow, in choosing to face the truth, I'd helped her find a sense of peace, even if it came too late to undo the past. A month later, Olivia and I took a long walk along the beach in the Hamptons. The sky was overcast, the breeze cool and gentle, and the sound of waves was like a lullaby for the soul. It was the first time in weeks I'd allowed myself to breathe. "I've been thinking," I said, my eyes fixed on the shoreline, "about starting a foundation, something charitable, something real." Olivia stopped, watching me carefully. "A foundation," she echoed, intrigued. "I want to help women like Vivian," I said. "Women who've been manipulated, hurt, trapped in toxic relationships. I want to create something that matters, not just as a way to atone for what Lance did, but to make a real change, something that goes beyond our name and wealth." Olivia's eyes lit up, her smile filled with pride. "That's a beautiful idea, Brock. I'll help you. We'll make it happen." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I smiled without forcing it. Standing there beside Olivia, with the ocean breeze in our hair and our hands intertwined, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known I needed, a quiet internal release. The burden of reputation, expectation, and inherited silence lifted just enough for me to remember who I was beneath it all. It hit me then, with clarity as sharp as the wind across the sea. The true value of family doesn't lie in opulence, not in sprawling estates or glossy headlines. It lives in the choices we make, in how we protect others, in how we own up to the damage caused, even if the culprit is someone we love. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud. It doesn't always come in grand gestures or legal battles. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, when we choose truth over protection, conscience over convenience. As the sun dipped lower, casting amber hues across the horizon, I turned to Olivia. "Have you ever had to keep a secret that you knew would hurt someone if it came out?" I asked softly. She gave me a small, thoughtful smile, one tinged with something melancholic. "Yes, Brock, I have. And I've learned something. Secrets can offer short-term protection, but only the truth can offer healing. As painful as it is, it's the only way forward." Her words echoed in me, stirring up memories, moments, everything I had buried under years of duty, secrets I had kept for the sake of appearances, lies told to shield the fragile pride of those who feared judgment more than wrongdoing. "My life, and maybe yours too," I said, "has come to rest at the crossroads of truth and silence. And now I wonder, how many of us carry secrets under the guise of love? How many of us have chosen to protect someone by hiding a painful truth? Maybe you've done it for a friend. Maybe for your family. Or maybe, like me, you had to choose between keeping peace and doing what's right. This story, my story, has been one of pain, conflict, and ultimately, liberation. But it's not just mine. I believe many of us have stood at that same threshold, grappling with whether to stay silent or speak out, and the choice, as impossible as it feels, always leaves a mark. Was there a moment in your life when you had to choose between truth and comfort, between silence and justice? What did you choose, and how did it change you? If you feel like sharing, I'm listening, because sometimes just acknowledging that moment, speaking it aloud even to yourself, is the first step toward peace. That day, with Olivia beside me and the horizon stretching wide before us, I felt the shift inside me solidify. I had let go of the role I was born into, and for the first time, I embraced the man I was choosing to become.